Living as we did up in the woods in Pennsylvania before we moved out to Nashville, we never had to think much about, tornadoes. Pennsylvania sees its share of twisters, but Tennessee has significantly more, though both states are dwarfed by Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma, et cetera, in the tornado tally. So after a year in Tennessee, it was not completely out of the ordinary when the tornado warning started blaring on our phones early Saturday morning, this past Saturday morning, around 3 a.m. We had a tornado watch before we went to bed, which means that conditions are such that there could be tornadoes. The warning comes in when actual funnel clouds have been sighted and you need to seek shelter immediately. It's always disconcerting huddling in the basement, listening to the winds that sound like Mack trucks speeding through your yard. But that's all it was in our neck of the woods. Lots of wind and noise and some downed power lines and then some scattered tree limbs, and that was basically the extent of it. Our neighbors, especially to the north and west of us, were not so lucky. Around 20 separate tornadoes, including one massive one that cut a path across some, they think, 200 miles and ripped through parts of Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, Missouri, hitting Kentucky the hardest. Over 100 people were killed, the majority in Kentucky, and the lion's share of those deaths were concentrated in one factory, a candle factory, where dozens of workers were killed when the factory was totally demolished by the storms. In fact, almost the whole town of Mayfield, where the factory was located, was destroyed. Images of the devastation look like, the aftermath of some kind of aerial bombardment during wartime. The Daily Wire was on the scene interviewing survivors. You can hear them tell the story in their own words and see some of the images. Take a look at this.
Never in my life seen destruction like this. Never.
First tornado warnings, we had a siren right there, so it's super loud, but at that moment I started getting mattresses out, just ready right by the closet that I planned on. It was the most center part of the house, so they was making fun of me, you know what I mean, but it's better safe than sorry. And then we went out on the front porch because I've personally never seen a tornado, and next thing you know, got real calm, and then I heard something like a freight train, and I've always watched documentaries and stuff, so all the power went out, and then I seen the tornado looked blue from the electricity, and it was probably about 2 streets over that way. That's when we seen it. So I immediately run in. The gentleman's laying in bed over there, so I bust his door down, tell him to get up, tornado's coming. He jumps in the shower, and we run over here. We get up in the closet and pull mattress over us. The whole house starts shaking. You hear things breaking. I was just praying the whole time, and it happened so fast, and it was calm. And everybody got out, made sure everybody was okay, and the first thing we thought of was getting out and helping.
So that's truly horrifying, and there's a sickening sort of helplessness that you feel when you're in the path of something like this. We had just a very, very small taste of that where we lived, because you know that you're at the mercy of nature, and if things decide to hit directly where you're sitting, no matter how many precautions you take, you're probably doomed. When you consider the force and the magnitude and the boundlessness of nature, it becomes all the more not only grotesque, but absurd after the fact when the political forces in our country attempt to turn these natural forces into a political issue. But that's exactly what happened here, as usual. With bodies still buried under the rubble, the media and politicians set out to make ideological hay out of the whole thing by tying the tornadoes to, of course, climate change, and claiming that we could have somehow prevented Saturday's disaster through well-written legislation. There could have been laws written to stop tornadoes. That's the claim. Here's President Biden.
Does this say anything to you about climate change? Or do you conclude that these storms and the intensity have to do with climate change?
Well, all that I know is that the intensity of the weather across the board has some impact as a consequence of the warming of the planet and the climate change. The specific impact on these specific storms, I can't say at this point. I'm going to be asking the EPA and others to take a look at that. But the fact is that we all know everything is more intense when the climate is warming. Everything. And obviously it has some impact here, but I can't give you a quantitative read on that.
Yes, we know that the climate change caused this. I can't say how or to what extent or offer any proof, but just go with my general statements anyway. We don't know how, but it happened. Actor Mark Ruffalo, last seen using cutesy pet names for child rapists in Kenosha, was more direct, tweeting, quote, "This is what hashtag climate catastrophe looks like. It's only going to get worse from here. Now it's time to fight for our suffering and despairing youth." Yeah, we have to fight tornadoes. Let's come up with our game plan to fight back against tornadoes. Rachel Vindman, a woman with an inexplicably large following, said, "Climate change, what does it look like? This is absolutely heartbreaking, and it's a direct result of climate change. Believe me, I know it's tempting to scream, yell, and question why people are so slow to accept reality, but we must have conversations with skeptics." Well, that's another thing that will stop tornadoes, conversations. Noelle Scoville, another woman with an inexplicably large following, wrote, "Sorry, Kentucky, maybe if your two senators hadn't spent decades blocking legislation to reduce climate change, you wouldn't be suffering from climate disasters. If it's any consolation, McConnell and Rand have effed over all of us, too." Now, she tweeted that, by the way, Noelle Scoville did, tweeted that early in the morning on Saturday. So it was like the very first thing she thought when she woke up to the news that 100 people were buried under rubble across, 3 different states. The very first thing she thought was, "Oh, this is going to be a great way. I could get a little dig in here against the Republicans and McConnell and Rand Paul." The media, of course, chimed in with explainers like this one from CNN, how the climate crisis is affecting tornadoes. And then this from Washington Post, "A warming world could add more fuel to tornadoes, scientists say." And so on. You get the idea. The consensus from all of these sources is that natural disasters like tornadoes happen because of us. These people believe, or at least they want us to believe, which is not necessarily the same thing, that there is actually legislation that can be written, laws that can be passed to stop tornadoes. So when they look at footage of an F5 tornado, and when most of us see footage like that, we see a force of nature. We see nature in all of its terrifying, deadly, essence. But what they see with the tornado is a policy failure. Tornadoes are policy failures. That's how they see it. Now let's be clear about something here. That view, to the extent that it's held sincerely, is straight up superstition. Okay, it's on the level of like a primitive tribesman who thinks that he can stop the rain or make the rain start or whatever, influence the weather by dancing around a fire and chanting certain things. In fact, it's worse than that. It's far worse than that, because at least the primitive tribesman has an excuse to be ignorant of the science. He doesn't have access to that information. He is making sense of the world with the information that he has available to him. The modern climate change alarmist should know better, and often does, but he spreads this nonsense anyway. Now, here are some facts to keep in mind on the issue of climate change and how it affects tornadoes. First of all, if natural disasters were getting deadlier, there would be a very obvious reason for that, which has nothing to do with climate change. There are more people on Earth. So a deadlier catastrophe is one, right, that kills more people. And if there are more people around, then that means that more people can die, because more people will be in the path of any given disaster. There are twice as many people in the Midwest today as there were in the 20s, for example, which puts twice as many people in the path of tornadoes. And yet, so that's if natural disasters were getting deadlier, that would be the reason. Yet, amazingly, what you find is that, in fact, a lot fewer people are actually dying in this way. Natural disaster deaths are at historic lows, not highs, in spite of the fact that there are so many more people around. As Andrew Follett, who's a former NASA scientist, he explained this weekend in a very enlightening thread on Twitter. In fact, the deadliest day for tornadoes in American history still was in the 20s, 1925. Not even 20 years after the Model T was first introduced. So not a lot of time for fossil fuels to be creating tornadoes, right? And yet 700 people died in basically the same region where 100 just died from tornadoes. And again, there were fewer people. Populations were more spread out, less dense than they are now. And yet the disaster was deadlier, much deadlier. Why is that? Well, it's because of the kinds of modern innovations that the left blames for natural disasters. Those innovations that get blamed for natural disasters are actually saving millions of lives from natural disasters. By the way, the deadliest hurricane in American history hit Galveston in guess what year? 1900. And we know about hurricanes as far back as the 1600s that were killing thousands of people. We can't go back farther than that because there was nobody around in this part of the world keeping reliable records. That's the other problem with comparing weather events across centuries. We've only been keeping track of these things reliably for a comparatively short amount of time. And so it's very hard. Nobody has any idea how many tornadoes hit the North American continent in the year 1350, for example, or how bad they were, or how many people died from them. We have absolutely no idea. We can't possibly know. Did a tornado hit this continent on March 7th, in the area where Kansas is now in the year 1272? Do you know the answer to that? Nobody does. There was no one around keeping records of it. There were people around, but they weren't keeping reliable records that we can use now to trace the weather. And yet you hear things like, oh, it was the worst storm in history. Well, how do you know that? What that always means is worst storm by certain metrics, we think, since we started keeping track a few decades ago. That's what worst in history means when it comes to weather events. Remember something. The earth is enormous and ancient. It didn't begin at the dawn of the industrial age, despite what you may have heard. Go back to the year 700 million BC, and there were weather events going on far more extreme than what we experience today. And the climate was changing, and the climate changes were far more drastic and devastating. Just that there were no people around to be affected by it. Go forward to the year 770,000 BC, let's say, and you'll see the earth getting battered by all kinds of extreme weather events. Same in the year 7000 BC, and 1000 AD, and the year 1550, and 1650, and 1721, and now in 2021. And yet, after these billions of years of history, where the earth has endured one catastrophe after another, we step into this chain of events in modern times and surmise that it's all our fault. And that we can actually stop it by writing words on a piece of paper and having a bunch of politicians sign it. The amount of ego required to believe this is almost impossible to fathom. And yet, at the same time, I can see why it's appealing in a certain way. Because I go back to that feeling of dread when the tornado warning sounds and you're huddled in your safe place that they tell you to go to, and you've got your kids and your families there, and it's only safe so long as the tornado doesn't get too close to it, right? It's scary to be so powerless and vulnerable in the face of these things that we can't control. So there's a comfort then in climate change hysteria. That's one of the great lessons of the last couple of years especially, is that there's a comfort for people find comfort in hysteria, believe it or not. Because it convinces you that you can conceivably control the uncontrollable and that you are not at the mercy of forces beyond you. But that's all a lie. It's an illusion. Stop fooling yourself and face reality. Well, I hope you enjoyed that clip from the Matt Walsh Show. If you did, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right down there so you can stay up to date on all of our future content.